Hello everyone, I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake, and I want to walk you through how to hand piece. The project I'm working on is Jen Kingwell's postcard number 2 project with the little bitty diamond. In a separate video I showed you how to trace the shapes. I have 2 shapes with me ready to go. These are right sides up. You know that when you sew right sides together. So I will be lining these shapes up like that because I want to construct the piece in rows and then I will sew rows together. I suppose you could do it and make diamonds and sew diamonds together. That would work too. You could make bigger diamonds, sew bigger diamonds together, whatever you want to do. All right, so I'm going to set that aside. Now, I've got these 2 shapes. Because I cut them out with the template, my seam allowances are accurate, but you want to make sure that you line up the 2 dots at the beginning. So I'm going to use my needle as a positioning pin and make sure I get those lined right up. And while I've got my needle in there, I'm going to swing it around and get it straight. I'm good to go. I can start sewing. Now, before I start sewing, I'm going to hold that and set it aside for a second. I'm using a needle that is a little longer and a little more rigid than I would use for hand applique. I'm using the number 9 tulip piecing needle. I like it for this. You might find another needle to be more useful, and that's perfectly fine. This is just what I use. I'm using the Superior's Masterpiece that comes wound on the bobbin. Trying to get the light good here. Wound on the bobbin. This is a 50 weight 2-ply thread. I don't want to use a thread that is either too thick or too fine. I want it to be strong. I think this is the perfect choice. So I'm using this in a neutral color that blends with the fabric. I forgot to do it before I picked this up, but I should have run my thread through Thread Magic. I don't know that it makes a difference. It makes it tangle less, but I suspect it's probably a good plan. So next time on the next shape, I'll run it through the Thread Magic. All right, I've already put an ending knot in my fabric, or I'm sorry, in my thread, so I'm good to go. I'm going to sew with a single strand. I'm holding the needle the exact same way that I do in my hand applique. However you want to hold the needle is fine, because honestly, this is the stitch, just like this. I'm holding both the needle and the fabric without moving my grip around much when I sew. It's more of an arm motion. It's not even exactly a wrist motion. Now, every few stitches, if you want to, when you reinsert your needle, you could throw in a back stitch just for grins, even a half back stitch. For those of you who hand quilt, you'll notice that this is just a whole lot like the rocking motion that you make when you hand quilt. Except that if you hand quilt towards yourself, you're not doing, I don't do this stitch toward myself. Yeah, I couldn't do it that way. You might be able to, but I cannot. You want to make sure that you sew right on the line. Keep your fingers pretty close to where the needle comes out of the fabric. In fact, that thumbnail, for me, it's my left hand. For those of you who are left-handers, it would be your right thumbnail. That thumbnail is helping to determine the length of the stitch. So if I move my thumbnail too far over, my stitches are going to be too long. If I have my thumbnail too close, it's going to be too hard to sew. So that right there is the key. Try not to do a running stitch like this, keeping the fabric flat, because your stitches will be too long. If you wanted to, if I had a longer piece that I was hand piecing, I would maybe pin this. Now, I'm going to pull this up here because where my last stitch is going to be, let me pull this up just a little bit. my last stitch is going to be right through the end, right there. Do not sew into the seam allowance and do not pull your stitches too tight. So I want to do a little back stitch here. And again, you have choices. I think if you're sewing with cotton thread and you throw in, say, 2 or 3 back stitches, that ought to be enough. That ought to work in lieu of a knot. However, if you just like to do a knot, and sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, then I would only do 1 little back stitch. Oops, I'm having trouble there. 1 little back stitch, and then I would do my typical ending knot. And I have a video for both the beginning and ending knots. But you see I left a loop of thread standing up, run the needle bottom to top through the loop, pull it tight. I would cut that off, leaving a tail, call it done. When I press this, I would press my seam allowances to one side, and then for whatever the next row is, I would press those seam allowance in the alternate direction. But when you are sewing rows together, you would stitch from here to here, do a little back stitch, and then in both cases, move those seam allowances out of the way so that they remain free. You would not want to press your seam allowances open because this is not like machine work where it's really tight. This is hand sewing with a single strand of thread. If you don't press your seam allowances to one side, I think you'd run into gaps perhaps once you layer and baste this, and breakage, thread-based breakage very possibly. So that's it. Hand piecing is fun, it's easy. I can't see any reason why you wouldn't enjoy it. So I hope you enjoyed this demonstration and may you have many happy stitches. Thanks for watching.